Hello and welcome to the Dissidents Podcast, brought to you by the Institute for Liberal Values. This is where we talk about how we can strive for a world in which freedom and reason are at the forefront of all human society. In this week's podcast, Elizabeth Spivak and Mike Burke discuss an article entitled Blame Then Shame, Psychological Predictors in Cancel Culture Behavior. In particular, we discuss how it seems to suggest evidence that, first, apologizing offers no protection against continued assaults on your character. Second, that it might actually give your accusers confirmation. And third, that very few people are interested in discussing alternative perspectives. Hello. Today we are talking about yet another article, psychological article, on cancel culture. This one is called Blame Then Shame, ? Psychological Predictors in Cancel Culture Behavior. And it's by a chap named Thomas S. Mueller. I can't see his institution.
It is Appalachian State
Department
University.
Of Communication.
Yeah.
Yes. Appalachian State University, Boone,
so
North Carolina.
He's not in psychology. He's in communication. So I just thought I just mentioned to you that I sort of wanted to read these last. So this is from the abstract. This is his summary. What he found was, and we're going to talk more about the methods and the measures and stuff, but those who demand an apology were more likely to be politically liberal and identify with female gender traits. He didn't ask gender specific, didn't ask sex, he asked gender traits. Those who chose to cancel wanted an apology. Then decided to assess personal character for those who committed in their minds, immoral, legal, or unethical acts. And there was a call for accountability with the understanding that society needs a social consensus on moral behavior. And so he concludes that these findings present an opportunity to develop thoughtful dialogue among individuals, corporations, organizations, and institutions about cancel culture. And that's why I had sent you this article, because I do think, there's really not, we talk a lot about like, oh, this article is about cancel culture. And then most of the time it's really not, right? Like we've found a connection. This person really set out to study cancel culture and had to devise, a method for doing so. I don't know if you have, before I talk about something.
I'm just surprised and delighted that they were able to get this published. Right?
Yeah.
I enjoyed it. I'm particularly interested in, there's the obvious and there's the not so obvious, right? So the obvious is people who identify as liberal, although, the usual caveat, the people who identify as liberal are certainly not what we in the Institute for Liberal Values would call as liberal. We'd probably call them authoritarians.
Right.
But, that it doesn't surprise me that the author found that they were more likely to demand an apology and attribute malevolent character traits to people for doing some perceived moral wrong. Neither does it surprise me that people who identify with conservatives are, for lack of a better term, actually generally more liberal in their views, insofar as they're more likely to kind of let live and let bygones be bygones. Forgive and forget. One of the things. It's just interesting how, certainly and again, I don't have any empirical evidence for this, but certainly, in my 20s, it would have been people who very much tribally identified as being liberal who would have been more likely to forgive and forget and live and let live. And it's just very funny how these things have just flipped. It's been this kind of polar switch. But it's nice to see evidence for that. The other thing, and this really comes off the back of an observation that Helen Pluckrose, our friend, made on Twitter in and we also recorded separately a podcast with Will Riley, who says that there's data on this. I'm not aware of that. I'll have to look it up, but that, you know, the people who are pushing cancel culture tend not to be men, but tend to be women, and specifically largely white, ethnically, you know, and upper middle class kind of women seem to be pushing that. It seems to find that there is a female connection with this too, which is very, very interesting. So that's what really leapt out for me about the paper, is that these connections are starting to be made. It's not just anecdotal observation, but there seems to be data arising.
Yeah. So, in order, obviously there's no measure at this point of the endorsement of cancel culture. So the author had to figure out how to create one, and what he did was interview people, and he does include his interview script and stuff in the paper here. So he interviewed 27 people. And then they analyzed the responses in order to thematically code for some statements that would be representative of cancel culture. So they ended up with 10 statements and that they were able to use for the the future scale. What I thought was interesting was even the people who, so in the study, this was not a study that was done on Amazon Turk or that was all college students. Now, one flaw I think in the paper is that he did not describe where these people, how he collected this data.
Right.
And I'm not entirely sure why the journal let him get away with that, honestly. So I don't know enough. I was surprised. But again, I'm in psychology, and so maybe that's part of the difference here. That I was a little bit surprised that his solicitation methods, although he describes his solicitation and the interview participants quite clearly, not so much for the survey respondents, but I digress. He does describe, a really broad range of participants. So he's got, here's some of the people massage
designer,
therapist, police sergeant, teacher, disabilities caregiver, so software developer. So he's got a broad range of people. He didn't, and ages, those are not necessarily in, is that in order? No, not necessarily. But I see a 39 and a 26 and a 22 and a 36. So, maybe not a super broad range of ages, but, 15-year range there. He actually shows I'm not sure why this is in there, but the map of where they collected their data. Okay, so they ended up with 10 questions about cancel culture. So it's best to keep your beliefs private because others might find them offensive. If someone is attacked for saying something inappropriate, they should apologize immediately. Now that becomes an important question. I don't judge a person without knowing more about their character. It's necessary for society to respect open debate from diverse perspectives. If someone is trying to grow and learn from their mistakes, I won't hold their past against them. For society to function, we must conform to a social consensus of moral behavior. It's acceptable to dig into a person's past. This becomes an important question when they hold social status in society. It's what is viewed as controversial and not acceptable usually shifts over time. If an action is immoral, illegal, or unethical, people should be held accountable, and critical thinking is an essential component of expressing free speech. So out of those 27 interviews, they found these themes that people were describing what, aspects of cancel culture. So those 10 questions, that's how they developed their survey. They also used something, and I'm going to, they also used something called an involvement inventory. And I did look that up. it was not specific to cancel culture, but you can plug in whatever you want. So they plugged in, to me, cancel culture is, okay? And these were the 10 questions. Important, interesting, relevant, exciting, means a lot to me, appealing, fascinating, valuable, involving, or not needed. So they had 10 questions about involvement in cancel culture and 10 questions that described aspects of cancel culture. They recruited, in the main part of the study, 986 people. And again, these were a broad range of people, and it's not totally clear to me, where they came, but all different professions, all different ages, quite a broad range of people. Predominantly white, 81%, and educated, 53%, and somewhat of a high income level. Did you notice that?
Mm.
Yeah. So 165 of them made more than $150,000 a year. So not necessarily representative. And they do apologize for that. They said not necessarily perfectly representative.
So just a quick
sample.
caveat, what that would mean in terms of the data on critical social justice, because I think that's relevant to cancel culture. This is where disproportionately the critical social justice advocate types live. They tend to be highly educated, high incomes, usually located on the east or west coast, almost none of them in between. So you would expect that there would be more critical social justice advocates captured because of the high income level. That would be what you'd expect from it.
So they analyzed those 10 cancel culture questions derived from the interviews singly. So they did single item analysis on that. They collapsed the involvement questions into an aggregate. So involvement and analyzed them. They did a network analysis. That was he did is a single author, so
Stop misgendering him.
Yeah, so just one author, yeah.
Actually, I don't know. He could be a Thomas and a female.
That's true. That's true. I wanted to say a little something about this network analysis that he did, because I looked up the reference. I had printed the article in black and white, and so then I had to go back and look at the picture. The idea was here that it's essentially a correlational analysis, and he looked at the connections between the different questions. So these, cancel culture questions. And so I thought this was I thought this was a good description of the network analysis, the reason why he did this. So he got this from a clinical psych article. And the person who wrote the clinical psych article describes this in terms of clinical disorders, that a network approach would say that a mental disorder does not just sort of explain the mental disorder, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So in the network approach, a disorder such as schizophrenia is no longer understood as a disease entity that explains the symptoms. Instead, it is an alternative, stable state of a network that is constituted by causal interactions between symptoms. So he gives an example. It can be illuminating to think of this network in terms of an ecosystem analogy. It is well known that ecosystems such as lakes have alternative stable states. A lake can be clear, or it can be, green and mucky. And, these stable states are a function of a highly complex interplay between the components that determine the overall state. So like the number of fish, the algae population, the amount of nitrites in the soil, and that kind of thing. So the stable state of there's different stable states of the lake, right? The lake can be clear, or it can be, mucky, as a matter of objective empirical fact. That would sort of be like the diagnosis, right? But the stable state of the lake is not properly conceptualized as a latent disorder that underlies or explains the state of the components of the system. So it refers to the global emergent state of the lake. And I thought that was important to mention because they're doing this. He did this analysis to sort of say, cancel culture isn't it's not a diagnosis, right? It's an emergent state of these factors. And that's was sort of an interesting, I would not necessarily have thought to analyze the data this way. And you can't do it unless you have a really big data set. So,
right.
Well, were you going to say something about that?
No, I was just thinking, when you look at a lake, let's say like a really clear lake and a murky lake, it doesn't follow that because the murky lake is murky that it is any less hospitable to life, or because the lake is clear.
Right.
You could have a crystal clear, beautiful lake that has been poisoned, like a swimming pool, right? It has full of chlorine, and
right.
nothing can live in there, and that's why you want to swim in it. And yeah, I mean, cancel culture arises, because immediately the temptation when you start to use metaphors like lakes is you're going to think, oh, cancel culture emerges from a murky lake,
Right.
Not necessarily. And also, I think that the authors, and this is something I liked, because this is something that we always try and do. The author is, this comes later in the paper, but the author is, tries to say, I'm not trying to say that cancel culture is something that is unambiguously negative.
Right.
It can be negative in his how, but it could also be used in very effective ways. And the immediate example springs to mind would be Me Too. The whole Me Too movement allowed a lot of sexual predators to be caught who would have failed the standard of evidence in a normal kind of legalistic system. Of course, there are negatives to that as well, because then you introduce bad faith actors who could make stuff up, and innocent people get caught too. But I just kind of like the analysis, the network analysis. I like the metaphor. Yeah, that was what I was going to say.
So the results were that there were some strong little groupings. So, for example, wanting to know more about the character of someone, wanting to debate diverse perspectives, and learning from mistakes. That was like a little node, that three node grouping that was strongly correlated. And those three things were negatively correlated, negatively related to that it was acceptable to dig into a person's past. So we have sort of like, oh, I want to know more about this person that might be canceled. I want to debate diverse perspectives, and I want to, I want to live in an environment where people learn from their mistakes, is negatively correlated with let's dig into people's past.
So, I mean, that's really worrying, isn't it? So,
yeah.
Essentially, the implication is, I don't want to forgive you. I want to find out everything that's wrong with you,
Right.
and punish you for it. Offense archaeology, if you like.
Yes, and then demanding an immediate apology. That the idea that there's a social consensus about moral behavior. Again, it's acceptable to dig into people's past, and that people who engage in what the person would consider immoral or illegal illegal or unethical behavior should be held accountable. Those were positively correlated with each other. So demanding an apology, there's a social consensus about what's moral. You should be held accountable for that, and that it's acceptable to dig into people's past. We're strongly connected to each other. So we have these little nodes, that are connected by thicker or thinner lines in this little network analysis. So I didn't think the author did a very good job of really explaining why a network analysis is interesting in this case. And so I did have to go to that other article to really get a good idea. So I thought that maybe the article would have been improved, I think, by a more thorough discussion. So I don't know.
Do you think that's maybe just a feature of the journal? It's a social science journal rather than a specific psychology one. And if he had gone to a psychology one, they might have kind of asked for those kind of amendments.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's this, I just think it's a really rich kind of interesting idea about, this sort of having to have almost this little perfect storm, right? That then creates, like you said, it could be, clear and still sick, right? Or it could be murky and healthy. And what does that mean? And when you look at the, the other paper, which maybe I'll link to just so that if people are interested, they're talking about schizophrenia symptoms and looking at how they cluster together and how what we think of as clusters of symptoms don't necessarily connect in ways that a different kind of analysis showed it. So
I really love this idea of network analysis, and it's not anything that I've come across before. It reminds me of the way in which, for example, we look at female emancipation. How did that come about? And usually people would say, oh, it was the suffragettes, and certainly that was a factor. But what were the factors that enabled people like the suffragettes to become acceptable? Or, how was their protest not cracked down on more severely than it was? Why was it that Martin Luther was able to articulate his criticisms of Catholicism? There had been certain social changes that made these criticisms more palatable. But certainly there were people who came before Martin Luther who would have thought and said very similar things. There were definitely people who thought and felt very similar things to the feminists before feminism became socially acceptable, or at least as socially acceptable to enable people like the suffragettes to make their kind of actions possible, right? And so, there are always kinds of things going on in the background. For example, industrialization or war efforts, when all the male population go over to fight in World War I and suddenly the females have to take over in the factories. That's another, environmental change that makes female emancipation possible. And just looking at cancel culture, and this is something that's not really analyzed, and I don't think he analyzes it either in any sufficient depth, but at least he raises the possibility. Let me rewind a bit. Critical social justice, critical race theory, queer theory, postmodernism, if you want to include that, critical theory, critical legal theory, all of these kind of movements existed before cancel culture was a thing, right? So we can see them all as ingredients to cancel culture. And I agree that they all are ingredients to it, but they alone don't create cancel culture because they were already rife within the institutions, like already rife within the universities, and there wasn't any cancel culture. So that can't be the whole thing. And so I love this idea of taking a step back and saying, well, okay, these are, let's say, microorganisms in the lake, and all is healthy in this, let's say it's a murky lake, all is healthy with these microorganisms in the murky lake, and maybe the lake still looks the same, but what has been introduced, and in order to make all of these changes possible, and the thing that he alludes to here is obviously social media. But I really like this way of stepping back and looking at things from a variety of different ways, rather than doing what I think a lot of the critics of critical social justice would be doing is kind of going into the ideology and mining it for bad thinkers or bad ideas. And there are bad thinkers and bad ideas in it.
Right.
But that's a kind of myopic way of thinking about it. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that, but put that in perspective. And I love this kind of taking a, thinking about it like for example, a lake. I think that's really, really good. And I wish there was more of that kind of analysis, actually.
Yes. Okay, so they did a linear regression, but I think the more what did they find? I mean, I just wrote down. People who were involved in cancel culture were those who wanted apologies, and so that involvement aggregate those 10 questions of involvement. People who were highly involved in cancel culture were also those who wanted apologies and who wanted to dig into people's pasts. So that was basically the
So they wanted apologies, but they didn't want to forgive anybody. So
exactly.
So what's the function of an apology?
Yeah.
Which underlines, let's just interject, when these people come after you, don't think that apologizing will help.
No.
Anecdotally, we know that it doesn't help. And now there seems to be growing empirical evidence that that's not what they're after. They're after shame, basically.
Yes.
We'll get to that.
So the next thing they did was a hierarchical decision tree model. And I'm actually going to, I call that a cart analysis. And so I'm actually going to, I can't remember what CART stands for. I was going to try to see if I could find it. Classification and regression tree. So a CART analysis. Okay, so he calls it hierarchical decision tree modeling. Again, I really liked this, but I had to do a little bit of reconnaissance. I haven't done any CART analysis in like 10 years. And so the way that this looked in the article is not the way that I remembered. And so I had to kind of go back, and I've got notes all over this because I thought it was a little sketchy in the way that he laid it out here. So here's my summary. Okay. So he is trying to predict apologizing immediately. So people are saying these are the people who demand an apology. Okay. And this is based on 970 of the people. They had to have answered the question on gender identity to be included in this. So a few people didn't answer that question. So that 970 became important when I was figuring out the actual numbers, because I had to use my addition and subtraction and division skills here. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about the left-hand side of the model, which is more important because that's where most of the people are. So of the 970 people, 789 would demand an apology. So that's 81%. Okay. So of those people, 39% of them just stopped. They wanted to know more about somebody's character, but they just stopped there. They were done. So they dig into somebody's character. So 377 of the 789, 39%, dig into somebody's character, demand an apology. They're done. That's it. Okay. So that's a pretty, that's a lot of people. 412 of them were interested in holding someone morally, ethically, or legally accountable, or they were interested in figuring out whether they should. So he called these the higher engagement people. Okay, so that's kind of good news, right? That's 42% of the 789 that want an apology. He says are higher, and they're interested in doing a little bit more. Okay. So what does it mean to think about holding someone accountable? Well, what it meant was, unfortunately, for many people, 72% of the 412, it meant that there's a social consensus on this issue and you should be held accountable to that social consensus. So they were done there. So they dug into somebody's path, they wanted to know more about them. And then they wanted to use the social consensus. A few people, only 53, were interested then in going beyond that and debating diverse perspectives. So we only get to 49 people by the time we get down to actually, most of them essentially, are not interested in doing that.
That's really rather tragic, isn't it?
Yes, it really is. So yeah, what did I say?
I mean, let's just kind of flesh out what that means. So, in the article, they say that the author draws a line between how right and wrong is settled in an explicitly socially authorized way, which would be the legal system. So you're tried, you are found guilty of a crime, and that's it. There's a chance for appeal, but basically you're guilty. And you'll pay a well-defined price for having committed that crime. Whereas trial by mob, trial by social media, there's a very significant proportion of people aren't even interested into looking even into whether you're going through the offense archaeology thing. They'll just assume that you're wrong. That's it. So they're not even interested. Right. Out of those that are interested, who might weigh up whether you're right and wrong, there are a significant number, but the number of people who would be willing to actually engage in a, for lack of a better term, social judicial process in order to establish someone's innocence or guilt is relatively tiny. And that means, if this is true, and it seems to be a fairly robust finding, that would seem to mean, or it would seem to follow, that therefore you've really got very little hope if you're being mobbed. So that is a rather depressing finding.
Yeah. And as you say, it's really, I wrote this down, it makes sense, why you shouldn't apologize, because it's basically not going to do you any good. So people are going to, regardless, they're going to dig into your past to know more about your character just for their own sort of personal pleasure or something. They're not actually going to they're still not going to think any more about it. Okay, they're interested in digging.
I want to be careful, because this is a psychological term, and I'm not trying to use it in a psychological way. I'm trying to use it in a naive way, in the kind of common parlance way. There is a kind of sadism in this.
There is.
You know what I mean? Again, not the psychological term, because you can measure it, right? I'm talking about how people would use the term sadism and sadistic in everyday conversation, in everyday English. We could do a corpus analysis, and this would tell us that this is the correct way of doing it. By the way, you psychologists out there, so don't get all... You have no authority over the English language. None of you believe in democracy. Anyway.
Yes.
So, there is a kind of really twisted sadism in this. It's as if people are willing to work hard and go through lots of boring posts about, I don't know, fish and chips, family pictures, reflections on the latest episode of Game of Thrones, and all the kind of usual stuff that fill up social media, in order to try to find something, to take it out of context, and to allege that it meant something that it probably didn't mean, to punish somebody. Has that ever happened to anybody you know?
Yeah, can't think of anyone.
I can't think of any examples though.
Yeah.
And the funny thing is, carry on.
Oh, I was just going to say, that's why the article is called Blame Then Shame, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's first, you know, first, it's like with, it's like, we will find racism, right? We will find it. We will, it's like,
We will.
yes. So, we determine that it's there first. There must be an apology first, and we'll find a reason why you have to apologize.
It's just like the Spanish Inquisition, isn't it? I mean,
Right.
quite literally. We're here to seek out heresy.
Yes.
Purge the heretic. If the Spanish Inquisition spoke in an old-fashioned English accent, of course, which they almost certainly didn't. But it's like a Hollywood trope, isn't it, to use old-fashioned English accents with the bad people?
Yes. So anyway, so only 49 people think that a cancellation decision is up for debate, basically.
Which is shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, I knew it was bad.
I know. So let's see. So there was a significant difference. This is a different analysis, an ANOVA. Significant difference in political identity related to overall involvement in cancel culture. So, the liberal identity, it was on a scale of 1 to 4. I shouldn't say that, on the low end. So on the 1 to 4, the scale was 1 to 10, but on the people who scored the most liberal, 1 through 4, were the most likely. There was no difference between white, these were all Americans, and Black or African American perceptions of cancel culture. Now, it was like 81, what did I say, 81% white. So, but still, no significant difference.
That kind of surprises me. I think if you were to include a larger number of Black Americans, I would be reasonably confident that you would find, especially working class Black Americans, I'd be reasonably confident that you would find more of them were against cancel culture than white people in general. Given cancel culture really seems to be a white thing predominantly.
Yeah. So, I don't know the author obviously, has a discussion section about this. But, again, as involvement in cancel, this is, one of his summaries, as involvement in cancel culture increases, the call to have a person apologize and then to dig into their past also increases. So we have, high involvement in cancel culture, a demand for apology, and then sort of a digging into the past. As citizens move towards conservative ideology, the intent to demand an apology actually tended to decrease. And conservatives also were less likely to believe that controversial issues, are sort of a product of the times. So I think...
So what's going on there? Probably some of that is Christianity. With the emphasis on forgiveness. Mary Magdalene, a former prostitute, was beloved by Jesus, for example. And that there is this kind of ethic of forgiveness that cuts all the way through Christianity. And a lot of conservatives, probably most conservatives, in fact, they're either Christian or they would say that they're culturally Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I would say that I'm culturally Christian, right? Like, I believe in not necessarily what's said in the Bible, but the Christian ethic as it is involved into today. And I believe in forgiveness. I think that forgiveness is really, really, really important. And, without that, society's screwed, basically, because people will just tear each other apart based upon tribal, ethnic wounds. And that's not productive in any way whatsoever. So maybe that in part explains why the conservative types tend to be less vengeful. Would that be the right word? I don't
Perhaps,
know,
yes,
perhaps vengeful.
and maybe just sort of oddly enough, fewer rules with fewer caveats.
Weird though, isn't it?
Where we might have liberals with sort of like,
See, but
look, this is how we do things now. So now you're not allowed to do those things, and that means that
now,
if
right?
you ever did them, you're a bad person because things have changed here.
And yet now we've got liberals who've gone from, Daryl Davis, right? Do you know him?
No.
He's a Black American musician, professional musician. Played with all of the big stars in the '60s and whatnot. He's still around today, and his hobby has been befriending Klansmen.
Oh, yes, I do. Yes, I do know this person.
Yeah,
Yes,
right.
yes.
And he converts them, and he's got like a proud wardrobe in his house full of KKK robes.
Right.
And it's like, he points that as evidence. Look at the good work that I've done, and he's kind of saving these people in a way. Do you know what I mean? He's rescuing them from a life of hatred, and that's very pure and motivated out of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
And it used to be on the liberal kind of left. It used to be that the liberal left was like that you would have people who had, for lack of a better word, graduated from very, very, very racist, fascist, even right-wing tendencies, and it was all about forgiving them and celebrating the role of goodness that they could bring. And it was
basic human decency, that there
right,
were some certain rules about the way that we interact with each other that is based on human decency.
So think about the movie American History X. Do you remember that movie? Did you ever watch that movie? So it's a great movie, and it's about a white skinhead. Edward Norton plays this white skinhead. It's a really, really good movie, and he's all mixed up in this kind of Zeke Heiling far right. He's got a big swastika tattooed on his chest, and
yikes.
Yeah, he's a skinhead and involved in violent crime and all kinds of stuff, and a real nasty piece of work. And he goes to prison, and he's with the far right gangs, but then he befriends a black guy in prison as well, and they become friends, and he comes out of prison. He then tries to save his brother from the far right gang. It's an amazing story of redemption. And that was produced by liberal Hollywood at the time, right?
Right.
And it was widely lauded. People loved that movie. I still absolutely adore that movie. And that was forgiveness for an actual skinhead who had actually committed hate crimes, albeit a fictional one. But we celebrated that as a culture, right? We celebrate it in the UK as well as the US. And the fact that we celebrated it is underlined by how well the movie did, both in terms of box office numbers, but also in terms of critic reviews and fan reviews. It's a real,
and apparently a cult following.
A cult following, yeah. So we celebrated the forgiveness of an actual far right criminal who hated black people and committed hate crimes, and had a swastika tattooed on his chest, which means he was celebrating in fact, there's music in the movie which celebrates the slaughter of Jewish people during World War II. So all of that he was guilty of, and we celebrated their forgiveness. And not only that, but the fact that they could be rehabilitated in order to do good. That was something that was worth celebrating. And now, at the present cultural moment, we offense mine, to try and find something that probably isn't even racist, like in your case. You were talking about reported speech. And the reported speech, very arguably, wasn't even racist either.
Right.
You were talking about a political movement. We're talking about black people in the reported speech. But, you should be able to investigate racist reported speech. Absolutely, if you want to understand racism, you should. But, I digress. But even that, you offense mine that the person needs to be shamed, blamed, damned. Right. And there is path backwards.
There's essentially no punishment that's good enough, right? It's like we just have to keep piling on.
What the fuck is wrong with us?
Yeah.
I mean, seriously. There absolutely must be a path backward. even especially for the likes of Edward Norton in American History X, because who is going to go and reach out to these people like he does in the movie who have been hoodwinked and brought into this horrible ideology? Who's going to pull them out? Well, it's going to be the people who understand how the ideology works, and the reason that they understand how the ideology works is because they've been hoodwinked too, and they know how to pull people out of it because they themselves have been pulled out of it, right? So we must be able to forgive them. That's essential. But the fact that we can't forgive innocence, or we can't forgive somebody maybe who was guilty of saying something stupid 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, Christ, thank God I wasn't on social media when I was 10.
Yeah. I mean, this isn't going away anytime soon, because there's a lot of people out there with a lot of stuff on social media that could be interpreted, God knows how many different ways.
A lot of people, most people, if they could find something racist with what you said that was clearly A, not racist, and B, reported speech anyway.
Well, I was going to say, I didn't even say it.
Yeah, and you're not even on social media.
No, it was it was 2 words in a survey. Yeah.
You didn't say it. It wasn't racist. It wasn't even a criticism of Black Lives Matter.
Right.
It was reported speech, and and you weren't even on social media. I mean, just wow.
Yeah.
So if they can do that to you, you think, you super wokey who's got all the right opinions, you think that these people aren't going to come for you? Of course they are. And we were talking with we don't know the order in which these podcasts will release, but there is a podcast that we have done with a chap called Ken Pope, who is the CEO of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Very similar thing happened in the Soviet Union. By the way, you don't have to believe that, critical social justice and communism is the same thing for this to be relevant. But, the Bolsheviks, first of all, they went after the rich people. Then they went after their comrades or former comrades, the Mensheviks. And then they started going after all the other Bolsheviks too. So, you thought that if you're in the, you're a party member with high status and you're enjoying all of the nice things that you're safe. No, because half of them were gone the next year too.
Right.
So, eventually these people will run out of people to cancel, and they'll they already are, start cancelling
turning on each other. Yeah.
That's the ideology. That's the feature of a victimhood seeking ideology, is eventually they will turn on each other. And this is not healthy. It really, really is not healthy. How depressing.
Let's see. Yeah. As respondent masculinity increased, the desire to demand apology decreased.
But aren't men toxic?
As liberal identity increased, their desire to forgive and forget decreased. We already discussed that.
Yeah, those people are not liberal.
And he says, the data, now this is all correlational data. So,
right.
His idea that, which comes first, right? The apology and then the digging. But our data suggests that demanding an apology is the root of cancel culture. It's sort of the beginning, the predominant group then opts to examine the character of the individual. Of those examining character, only the most highly diligent, which is very few, as we know, decide to hold only those that are morally or illegally or ethically accountable. And then there's only even fewer who are willing to even, have a discussion about that. So must apologize plays out as sort of, the controversial sort of question here, because as we said, it's this demand that it really doesn't it doesn't matter. The answers, and certainly that happened to me. I don't know if it happened to you, but over and over and over again, I got, emails. They tried to, the provost and the dean of students met with my students and tried to get them to apologize, and, all this sort of like pressure, all campus emails, pressure from my, multiple emails within my department, from my department chair, that the fact that we wouldn't apologize for good science you know, meant, just, meant a lot about our culture. I get a lot of stuff still. People are saying, that kind of, people are saying, yeah.
So what I got was quite funny. I didn't apologize. I said, I'm sorry if you felt that way, but that isn't what I intended, and it's not fair to mind read that into my intentions. Is what I said to one of them. And then a couple of weeks later, quite a few months later, actually, somebody associated with this person approached me and said, I know you apologized, but no. I didn't apologize. I said, I'm sorry if you felt that way, because I genuinely didn't want that person to feel that way. I wasn't apologizing for my actions because I did nothing wrong. And it was extremely unfair in order to mind read kind of intent that I don't have. So actually, I feel that I'm the one deserving with an apology. But, don't worry about it. It's okay. That was the kind of way. So I actually had to correct them on me having apologized, because I wouldn't apologize. Don't ever give them that kind of weakness.
No, because it's useless, and it only
Well, it's not only useless. It's useful to your attackers.
It's useful to them. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
You've admitted wrong.
Right. And so now we're going to find out all the ways that you're wrong.
And we're justified for punishing you as well, right?
Right.
Even by your own admission, we're justified for punishing you.
So I don't know. I mean, I think this was as presented, as the author says, it presents an opportunity to develop thoughtful dialogue, and let's get this research party started on what.
Yes, all 42 of us.
No, I think it was 39, wasn't it? Anyway,
39.
Yeah. Wait a minute. Let me look. No, it was 49. We were
49.
Yeah,
okay.
49. Yeah, 49. So I do think. I mean, again, I don't think this article was perfect by any means. I liked that he used some sort of innovative methods to look at the data. I thought that that those actually could have been even further explicated, like give the reader a little more depth. And I'm not sure. I don't want to read, more into it than I should. So, but I did, I took a few liberties by doing some quick math and reading a couple of other articles. But I agree. I agree with the author. I think this is a good start, and I'm excited that it got published. Honestly. I really am.
So let's give a big well done to the Social Science Journal and Routledge.
Yes, and Thomas. Is it Mueller or Mueller?
Mueller.
Yeah.
I don't know. I'm reading Mueller, but sorry if it's Mueller. Good work, and I think he admits a lot of the problems in his limitations section. So. Well done to all involved. Good stuff.
Yes.
And on that note, thank you very much for listening, and we will be back soon.